1. Ancient Egypt, not what movies sold you. Here's what actually happened at the pyramids. They weren't built by endless chains of whipped slaves collapsing in the sand. Archaeology dug up workers' villages right beside the Giza Plateau, stone barracks, bakeries, breweries, cattle bones, bread ovens, and medical care. Names of rotating work gangs are literally carved in the blocks. These were skilled laborers on rations and housing, organized like a national infrastructure project. Enslaved people existed in Egypt, but the plantation-style chattel slavery you see in films is a totally different system, much later and elsewhere. Most people think Cleopatra was a native Egyptian queen. She ruled Egypt, yes, but she was Macedonian Greek, descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals. That doesn't make her less Egyptian in practice. She was the first of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language and present herself to Egyptian audiences as a traditional pharaoh. Politically, she was sharp, fluent in multiple languages, negotiating with Rome's power brokers, running a complex economy. The stereotype of a seductress manipulating men ignores the reality that she was a multilingual head of state navigating an empire next door. Let's talk about curses. The mummy's curse took off after 1922 when Tutankhamun's tomb was opened and newspapers needed drama. They cherry-picked some untimely deaths, ignored that most expedition members lived long lives, and spun a supernatural story that sells better than archaeology, involves dust, cataloging, and a lot of patience. Ancient Egyptians feared desecration and wrote protective texts, sure. But the Hollywood idea of a death sentence for opening a tomb is a modern media creation. The pyramids weren't random piles either. The Great Pyramid is aligned to the cardinal directions with jaw-dropping precision. Its sides are within a tiny fraction of a degree of true north. That level of accuracy took careful surveying, sighting stars, and rigorous logistics. You're looking at a civilization that moved millions of stones across organized ramps, causeways, and work teams, not chaotic crowds yanking ropes while a villain shouts. Makeup wasn't just glam, that iconic kohl around the eyes. It helped reduce glare in sunlight and may have had antibacterial benefits thanks to lead-based compounds prepared in very low concentrations. Combine that with ritual meaning and social signaling, and you've got something more like a health, status, and religious toolkit than the purely decorative movie version. And yes, Egypt had slavery, but the category was broad. Debt servitude, prisoners of war integrated into households, and corvée labor obligations appear in records. It wasn't a uniform system across 3,000 years. Treating slavery in Egypt like a single monolith is like compressing every labor contract from the 170s to today into one law. Movies flatten nuance into a whip and a chain. The reality is administrative tablets, contracts, and social hierarchies that shift across dynasties. Now the logistics. Do you ever notice how films show a heroic architect pointing at a cliff and the next scene is a finished pyramid? In truth, the supporting infrastructure was the real star. Nile flood schedules, quarry timing, river transport, ration distribution, and seasonal labor cycles synced with agriculture. When the Nile flooded, farmers couldn't sow, so the state redirected labor to national projects and fed them. That's not cruelty. That's a clever use of downtime to build something that still dominates the skyline. Another quiet myth, that Egyptians were technophobes stuck in ritual. They were obsessive measurers and record keepers. Rope stretchers resurveyed fields after the river shifted boundaries. They developed copper and later bronze tools, stone pounders, sleds with water-lubricated sand to reduce friction, and clever levers. The movie version shows brute force, the real version shows human ingenuity. Microstory, a visitor to the workers' cemetery expects starved, broken bodies. Instead, osteology shows healed fractures, evidence of medical care, and repetitive stress patterns consistent with heavy work, plus enough protein to keep them going. When you feed, house, and treat workers, it's because you value them. Gladiator owners in Rome did the same with fighters. Egypt did it with builders. One more, the desert isn't a blank beige backdrop. The Giza Plateau was a humming hive, quarries ringing with copper chisels, ramps crawling with hauling teams, overseers tracking stone tallies, bakers turning out thousands of loaves a day, brewers filling jars of beer as wages. The mystical lone pyramid vibe works for cinema, but the reality is an industrial-scale project city at the edge of a metropolis. Finally, Cleopatra again, because the casting cliches won't die. Her ethnicity gets argued to score modern points, but the evidence is thin for anything beyond her Macedonian lineage. What we can say with confidence, she cultivated an Egyptian identity politically, leveraged Greek culture administratively, and dealt with Rome pragmatically. Reducing her to a romance subplot erases the policy moves that kept Egypt independent as long as it was. Once you understand that Egypt's wonders came from organized labor, precise measurement, and pragmatic statecraft, not curses and chains, the whole story sharpens. Head north, the next lie wears a horned helmet. 2 Vikings, horns, Hygiene, and Hollywood. Most people think Vikings charged into battle wearing horned helmets. They didn't. There's zero archaeological evidence for horns on helmets from the Viking Age. The The few horned headpieces found in Scandinavia are Bronze Age ritual items, not combat gear. The horned image took off in the 1800s when opera costumers wanted a dramatic silhouette. It stuck because it looks cool on posters, not because it ever showed up on a longship. Here's what Vikings actually wore. Simple iron helmets with a rounded or conical cap, sometimes a nasal guard. Mail shirts, shields, spears, axes. Practical, repairable gear for people who were sailors first, fighters when needed. And that brings us to the next myth. Vikings were not just frothing raiders. They were traders, settlers, and lawmakers. They founded towns like Dublin and York, ran thing assemblies where disputes were settled, and managed property rights with contracts. Raiding happens when politics and opportunity align, but the day-to-day was commerce and farming. Hollywood paints them as filthy brutes, yet Viking sites turn up grooming kits all the time. Combs carved from bone, ear scoops, tweezers, razors, toothpicks. There are even accounts from their neighbors grumbling that Scandinavians bathe too often. Weekly washing on Saturdays shows up in sources. Think about it, sailors living in close quarters can't function if everyone's covered in grime. Hygiene was social strategy as much as cleanliness. Women had more legal agency than you'd expect from the movie version. Viking-age women managed farms, inherited property, and could initiate divorce in certain circumstances. Those keys you see on women's belts and graves, that wasn't random decoration. Keys symbolized authority over household stores and economic decision-making. It wasn't a modern democracy, but it wasn't a lawless patriarchy where women had no say. Agency existed inside a known framework, and it mattered. Berserkers, films show an army of shirtless, permanently frothing warriors biting shields and ignoring pain. The reality is narrower and more debated. Berserker appears in sagas as a specialized role, sometimes royal bodyguards who might have used ritual chant and altered states before battle. Were substances involved? Possibly, but the evidence is thin. What's clearer is that Berserker behavior was exceptional, not the default. Most fighters needed coordination, shields aligned, spears timed. You can't row a ship, land, form a shield wall, and raid a monastery while everyone's blackout raging. Navigation is another place where the wild luck myth falls apart. You'll hear about sunstones, optical crystals that can polarize light to locate the sun through clouds, and yes, there's experimental support that it works. But even without that, Viking sailors mastered coastal pilotage, reading currents, bird flight paths, whale routes, and the color of water to judge depth. They used latitude sailing by sun height and held memory maps in poems. You don't hit Iceland, then Greenland, then North America by accident twice. Microstory, a reenactor once told me, you can't run in Viking kit. Then a museum team had volunteers row, disembark, jog burden, set a camp, and strike it all in replica gear. The result, manageable. The gear was built for movement because movement was the job. That's the thread Hollywood drops, practicality. Horns catch rigging, excessive metal tires rowers, poor hygiene spreads disease on long voyages. Survivors optimize. Another sticky myth is that Vikings were a single, unified people. In reality, Viking is more of an activity label than an ethnicity. Going Viking meant a raiding or trading expedition. You had Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, Islanders, and diaspora communities with local variations in style, law, and politics. Some settled permanently, intermarried, and blended cultures. That's why you find hybrid art motifs in places like the Danelaw, knotwork meets Anglo-Saxon forms. Let's hit religion quickly. Movies either make them cartoon pagans or proto-atheists. The real religious world was layered: Norse myths, local cults, oath rituals on rings, ship burials for elites in some regions, and constant change as Christianity spread. Conversion took generations and looked like pragmatic adoption, elite alliances, trade ties, and flexible rites, less overnight temple burning, more dual practice until the church, courts, and kings enforced uniformity. Violence, yes, but structured. The famed blood eagle likely isn't a literal ritual performed on the regular. It reads like saga-era literary horror. Real violence was tactical: ambushes at river bends, fast strikes on poorly defended sites, hostage-taking for ransom, not endless slow-motion duels under thunderclouds. And in legal sources, compensation payments and feud regulation mattered more than theatrical finishing moves. Why does the horn myth survive? It's a costume designer's dream and a brand logo. But once you understand that Vikings succeeded because they were adaptable, farmers who could become sailors, traders who could become warriors, you see why they left such a wide footprint. Their secret weapon wasn't horns, it was logistics, law, and seamanship. One more quick correction: they didn't vanish. Their descendants became Normans, ruse elites, and citizens of the kingdoms they helped shape. The culture morphed as all living cultures do, through marriage, treaties, markets. That continuity is why you can still trace legal traditions and place names back to longships. So drop the horns, keep the combs, and remember the keys at the belt. From longships to legions, the Roman lies are louder. 3. Rome, thumbs, vomitoria, and gladiators. Most people think a gladiator's fate was decided by a cartoon gesture: thumbs up for mercy, thumbs down for death. That's not how Romans signaled. The sources are murky, but pollis verso just means with a turned thumb, not which direction. Some evidence suggests a closed fist with hidden thumb could mean mercy, while an extended thumb mimicked a sword and meant finish him. And crucially, the editor's decision wasn't a crowd-pleasing coin flip. It weighed the fighter's performance, the sponsor's finances, and the event's reputation. Another stubborn myth: vomitorium equals a fancy Roman puke room. No, in amphitheaters and theaters, a vomitorium is an exit passage that spews out crowds quickly. It's about crowd flow, not digestion. Romans absolutely indulged in feasts, and some texts mock gluttony, but the architecture term got twisted centuries later into a gross joke that refuses to die. You can tour surviving stadiums and see the vomitoria, arched corridors designed to move tens of thousands in minutes. Gladiators weren't disposable meat. They were investments. Training a fighter took months, even years. Diet, conditioning, technique. They fought under rules with referees carrying long staffs to separate clinches and stop illegal strikes. Most bouts ended before death because dead fighters don't sell rematches. Inscriptions and medical evidence show healed injuries consistent with repeated, regulated combat. Yes, deaths happened, but often as rare climaxes or punishments, not every Saturday afternoon. Lead pipes doomed Rome. Heard that one? It's more complicated. Romans used lead plumbing, but many aqueducts fed water with high carbonate content that formed protective scale inside pipes, reducing leaching. Exposure still occurred, especially via lead acetate used as a sweetener in some wines, but the lead made everyone crazy and caused the fall. Narrative oversells a single factor. Rome collapsed through a knot of problems: political fragmentation, military overreach, economics, invasions, disease. Lead wasn't the keystone. Movies dress every Roman in a toga, like it's jeans and a t-shirt. In reality, the toga was formal wear for male citizens during public life, legal proceedings, ceremonies, politics. Daily clothing was tunics and cloaks. Women didn't wear togas, they had stola and palla. The toga itself was a heavy, carefully arranged wool garment that signaled status and occasion. If you've ever struggled into a tux, you get the vibe. It's not Aaron's attire. And Nero fiddling while Rome burned? There were no fiddles. The Great Fire was in 64 CE. Bowed string instruments like the violin family are much later. Some sources say Nero performed the sack of Ilium on a stage as the city burned, which reads like propaganda. Others indicate he organized relief, opening gardens for refugees, arranging grain, pushing building codes after the fire. Nero was a controversial ruler, and hostile writers loved a dramatic smear. But here's where it gets interesting: the arena economy. Gladiator schools were private businesses or state-run with contracts, appearance fees, and medical staff. Fighters ate a high-carb barley and beans diet that built mass and endurance. Chemical analysis of bones backs this. They weren't shredded sprinters, they were durable show athletes trained to take hits and keep going. The movie image of frenzied chaos misses the choreography, the weapon matchup logic, and the referee's authority. Everything changes when you look at crowd dynamics. The amphitheater was a social pressure valve, politics, identity, and class all on display. Sponsors earned clout by delivering fair, exciting games. Killing a popular fighter despite a strong performance could backfire publicly. That's why gestures mattered less than precedent and public mood. Mercy could earn goodwill and future ticket sales. The crowd shouted yes, but the editor decided within a system that balanced spectacle and sustainability. Now, bread and circuses gets quoted like all Romans were easily bribed by snacks. The phrase from Juvenal is satire, social criticism of elites buying complacency. Real Romans worked, worshipped, served, schemed, studied. Entertainment coexisted with civic life: law courts, baths, markets, collegia, military service. Reducing a 1,000-year civilization to popcorn and panem et circenses is the same flattening movies do to everything else. Let me show you another miscast detail: gladiator pairs. They weren't uniform. You had the Murmillo with a large shield and Gladius versus a Thrix with a curved Sica and smaller shield, or a Retiarius with net and trident against a Secutor with smooth helmet designed to shed that net. These pairings tested styles, not just strength. Victory looked like tactics under constraints: footwork, shield angles, stamina, not a berserk sword windmill. And those vomitoria again, think modern stadium design. Engineers borrowed Roman solutions because they worked. The Romans were obsessed with moving water, people, and goods efficiently. Aqueduct gradients over long distances, road networks with milestones, harbor logistics. They were logistics nerds. When a term gets meme-ified into a bathroom joke, you miss the real genius: civil engineering that still sets standards. Microstory: a reconstructed arena demonstration used trained performers with blunted weapons and a referee. In 3 minutes, the ref stopped the action twice for illegal strikes. The crowd booed at a premature call, and the sponsor signaled missio, mercy, after a clean knockdown. The audience left talking about technique, not gore. That's closer to reality than the body count montages. So toss the thumbs up trope, retire the puke corridor, and remember the fighters as skilled pros inside a rule-bound entertainment industry. The legions built an empire, but the arenas managed a city. Medieval times weren't a mud-soaked misery montage. Let's go there next. For the Middle Ages, not dark, not dumb. You probably picture the Middle Ages as 1,000 years of grime, ignorance, and random stabbing. Here's what actually happened. People bathed a lot more than films admit. Urban Europe had public bathhouses, monasteries had rules for regular washing, soap-making guilds appear in records. Moralists and saints complained that some folks lingered in baths for vanity and gossip. You don't write angry sermons about bathing unless people are doing it. Most people think medieval Europeans believed in a flat earth. Educated writers from Bede to Thomas Aquinas accepted a spherical world inherited from Greek and Roman astronomy. Universities taught Ptolemaic cosmology with a round earth at the center. Mariners knew ships dipped below the horizon. The flat earth Middle Ages were invented later as a Renaissance dunk on the past and then amplified by modern pop culture. Witch burnings, the brutal European witch hunts peaked in the early modern period, 1500s to 1600s, when printing, religious conflict, and legal shifts created a storm. Medieval courts often demanded high evidence standards. Church inquisitors frequently preferred penance over pyres for superstition cases. Executions happened, yes, but they weren't a daily medieval background event. The constant bonfires of women image is a timeline error that collapses centuries to make the past look uniformly monstrous. Chivalry gets framed like a gentleman's code that tamed warfare. The real story is messier. Knights swore oaths, quoted virtues, and commissioned poems about mercy, but they still burned crops, sacked towns, and ransomed prisoners. Rules existed and were sometimes followed, especially toward peers, but brutality against civilians remained common. The code restrained some behaviors while leaving others conveniently outside the rules. Warfare was political, economic, and legal all at once, not a tournament with roses. Now the science you never see. The Middle Ages built the university as an institution. Bologna, Paris, Oxford. They systematized disputation and commentary, argued about physics, optics, and medicine. Roger Bacon wrote about experimental method. Ibn al-Haytham's work on vision flowed into Latin Europe. Scholars debated motion and impetus theory centuries before Galileo. Mechanical clocks appeared in the 1200s. Watermills and windmills spread power across landscapes. This wasn't a knowledge blackout. It was a platform built for the next revolutions. Even the Black Death story is more than leeches and prayers. Quarantine measures emerged in Italian port cities, Trentino 30 days and Quarantino 40 days, holding periods for ships, health boards policing movement, bills of health for travelers. Communities organized pest houses, modified burial practices, and tracked outbreaks with municipal records. Treatments were based on humoral theory and often ineffective, but the administrative response, cordon sanitaires, isolation, became public health foundations. That's a legacy, not a punchline. Let me show you urban life. Medieval towns weren't just muddy alleys. They had guild rules for product quality, market courts to settle disputes fast, night watches, curfew bells, weights and measures standards, and fines for dumping waste in streets. Were they spotless? No. Did people care about order? Absolutely. City councils passed sanitation ordinances because residents demanded them. Education wasn't limited to cloisters. Cathedral schools predated universities, and vernacular literacy grew with city commerce. Notaries produced contracts by the thousands. Women in certain regions ran shops, managed workshops when husbands traveled, and in some trades held guild membership. Nuns wrote theology, copied texts, and supervised hospitals. It wasn't modern equality, but it was more dynamic than the silent peasant women montage. Technology quietly scaled. The heavy plow transformed clay soils in northern Europe. The horse collar increased draft power without choking animals. Three-field rotation boosted yields. Eyeglasses show up in the late 120s, extending the working lives of scribes and artisans. Papermaking spread from the Islamic world into Europe, lowering the cost of books well before the printing press multiplied them. Progress looked like incremental fixes adding up to major shifts. Art and architecture. Cathedrals were engineering feats, flying buttresses, rib vaults, pointed arches distributing loads to push buildings higher while filling walls with stained glass. Those windows weren't just pretty, they were complex chemical recipes for color and light. Manuscript illuminators layered gold leaf and pigments sourced across continents. Trade networks moved lapis from Afghanistan, alum from Asia Minor, and dyes from the Mediterranean. A dark age doesn't coordinate that supply chain. Medicine had a framework. Humer's theory was wrong in mechanism but structured observation. Pulse charts, urine wheels, regimen advice on diet and exercise. Surgeons like Guy de Chauliac documented procedures. Anesthesia by soporific sponges existed in some practices, and hospitals, especially in the Islamic world and later across Europe, provided organized care. Again, not modern but rational within available theory. Justice wasn't only trial by combat. You had manorial courts for local disputes, merchant courts for fast commercial decisions, canon law for ecclesiastical matters, and royal courts asserting central authority. Ordeals faded after the 120s as legal rationalism grew. Contracts, charters, and precedent mattered. The legal mind of the Middle Ages built the bones of later common and civil law. Micro-story, a traveler walking from Chartres to Paris can find way stations, toll points, bridge repairs recorded in account books, and standardized coin exchanges under royal ordinance. That paper trail means administrators tracked revenue, enforced weights, and inspected bread loaves. Bureaucracy isn't cinematic, but it's civilization. So why does the dark and dumb myth stick? It flatters modernity and simplifies teaching. One bleak backdrop makes every later advance look like a miracle. But once you understand that medieval people bathed, studied, built, engineered, healed, and governed, imperfectly, creatively, persistently, the timeline stops being a cliff and starts being a slope. Swords weren't lightsabers either. Let's talk battlefield myths next.